Hola a todos los internautas, hoy es el miércoles de la poesía. Os presento la canción del Jinete de Federico García Lorca, traducido por Horseman, con enlace en el doobly-doo. Córdoba, lejana y sola. Jaca negra, luna grande, aceitunas en mi alforja. Aunque sepa los caminos, yo nunca llegaré a Córdoba. Por el llano, por el viento, jaca negra, luna roja, la muerte me está mirando desde las torres de Córdoba. ¡Ay, qué camino tan largo! ¡Ay, mi jaca valerosa! ¡Ay, que la muerte me espera antes de llegar a Córdoba! Córdoba, lejana y sola. The translator put a comment on his blog that's worth commenting on. Last week we were talking about translation theory and how there's always a trade-off between being completely clear and faithful to the original message of the writer and rendering the poem into something more convincing for a reader in the target language. When addressing an alternative, much more literal-minded translation, Horseman wrote this: "Ultimately, any translation is a process of addition and subtraction. It's just a matter of whether that process produces something worth reading and not an act of cultural narcissism." What he seems to be implying here is something I think we should be talking more about. While translation, of course, is an act of rendering works into new languages and reaching new audiences, more often than not, it results into works that are somehow different from the versions that they're translating. All translators operate with a certain audience in mind. A great example of what I'm talking about is the translation of holy books. A translation of the Quran for language scholars is not going to be the same as a translation of the Quran for theologians, and neither of those is going to be the most useful translation for English-speaking Muslims or for English speakers who aren't Muslims. What Mr. Foreman seems to be implying is that we need to stop pretending as if translation were a neutral tool for perfectly rendering one text into another. Plenty of you have seen how useless and inadequate that kind of mentality is when you're using an electronic tool like Google Translate, for instance. There is no conception of who's receiving the text on the other end and what kind of biases or implied knowledge they're going to have. Which is why I think it's ultimately worth considering, at least for a moment, the idea that translation is a kind of literature in itself. And that if we realize we can't capture every single cultural and linguistic overtone in the poem, we can at least understand some of its tone and message and character. Also, I just think this is a really good poem and I want to read more García Lorca.